Welcome to Bible Believers Fellowship, where we love you enough to tell you the truth. On these programs, you will be able to follow our expository study of the Authorized King James Version as we read verse by verse through books and occasionally tackle important topics for the purpose of helping Bible believers gain a thorough and accurate understanding of God's Word. We now invite you to join us in our study. All right, Jude, we left off in verse 10. Go ahead and read that to start us off, Mike.
Verse 10?
Yeah, just read verse 10.
But these speak evil of those things which they know not. But what they know naturally is brute beasts, and those things they corrupt themselves.
And I just want to emphasize before we move on that we're seeing that these guys pretend to be religious and spiritual, but they're really fleshly. This is all about the flesh. But it's sold as spiritual.
Right.
And that's something you really have to keep an eye on. A lot of this is just, a lot of these things being sold in the name of spirituality, they're mental things, like psychology type things. They are more, for example, yoga. And no matter what anybody says, yoga is an occult practice. And you really are doing nothing more than manipulating the amount of oxygen that's going into your body through breathing techniques. That is a physical thing, and it physically affects your mind. But although that in and of itself isn't a spiritual thing, so yoga is not spiritual, and yet it can then open your mind to the spirit world. Because when you put yourself in an altered state of mind, you're opening yourself up to the spirit world. That's what happens in a lot of these charismatic churches where they're so emotional and everybody's running around and hyperventilating and sweating profusely. And we've got a friend who used to go to a church where they actually had people whose job it was to carry a bucket to catch vomit. Because every week they were supposed to be casting out devils out of people and they're vomiting. Every week, she said, that somebody would vomit into these buckets. Well, now, there's where you're kind of like, well, maybe there was something spiritual to that, but it's the wrong spirit. But other people just work up into a frenzy and toss their cookies, you know what I mean? But none of that is God's spirit. And we're going to see that in a minute, a few verses later, that we'll talk more about that, being sensual. But these guys are leaders. They've come into the church. Jude uses examples that his people, that his readers would have known. When he talks about these different things that happen in the Old Testament, that's the only Bible they had. So Jude's readers knew what he was talking about. Now today's Christians need to take the time to read what these things are all about. And we've done that with some of these, the ones that we haven't already studied recently. And you go back and you look and you can see that every instance that he's talking about is someone who has come into, for example, coming into Israel. He's referring to, we're getting ready to see that in a minute. Yeah, in verse 11. But he's talking about people who came into the body. And they weren't coming from the outside and throwing rocks. They were inside and causing discord by teaching falsely. And so that's what we're seeing today. And I want to go ahead and get into that in verse 11, where he shows you an example of what kind of people came into the believers of the Old Testament, came in their midst and caused these kind of things. Go ahead and read just verse 11 then, Mike.
Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the heir of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Kor.
You have three people mentioned, and Cain, Balaam, and Kor. Cain's sin was pride. Balaam was greed. And Korah is jealousy. And those three people had these three main sins that pushed them to then basically defy God and God's message. Now, keep that in mind as you look in the world we live in today. The false teachers we're surrounded by, they are driven by these same sins. Pride, greed, and jealousy. They want to be the big cheese. there have been attempts to do things to, for example, reach out and minister to people in the inner cities. And a bunch of big-time preachers with big ministries and multi-million-dollar budgets have come together, and it blows up. Too many egos in the room. Balaam should have cut and run when was it Balak? Balak was his name, who was trying to get Balaam to curse Israel. And Balaam should have cut and run, but he didn't, because he was being rewarded by this guy in the past and in that circumstance right there. And then you have Korah, who is jealous. And the jealousy drives these guys to try to be bigger and better than the other guy. And so their message isn't for souls. Their message is for whatever's going to put them ahead of the other guy. Whatever's going to make their ministry bigger than the other guy's ministry. And so they're not really concerned about souls. Almost, well, I only say almost because I've not been involved in every denomination, but the denominations are driven by that. The denominations want to be the big cheese. They want to get bigger than the other denomination. Groups like the Free Will Baptists that I'm more familiar with, the Church of the Nazarene, they started out wonderful. But they all got together and decided we need to be more like the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Catholics. So then they started making their districts and putting a man on top of the district, and then or a district superintendent, and then, or they would appoint a general, what they call in the Free Will Baptists, they were called executive secretaries. Yeah, over the conventions. And it just became another denomination. And they wanted your numbers, Jim. You better give us so many baptisms. Your offering had better be so much. You'd better had so many people in Sunday school with such a percentage of increase in visitors, and you better have distributed this much literature and all that kind of thing. But it was all about numbers. It wasn't about souls. And that's what's driving modern religion today. And of course, religion, as I've said over so many times, religion is basically taking the truth of God and then distorting it and making it difficult and turning it into something that it never should be. And when you talk to your friends, a lot of those friends have a wall that they can't listen to you when you try to talk to them because they've been raised in religion. And they've seen all this stuff. Talked about who we were talking to this past week. What's his problem? He's got all these religious things that he's experienced. And it's destructive. And that's one of the great things that we have to deal with when we're trying to witness to people and talk to them about the Lord. And how many people, I've gone door to door, and over a period of 20 years, I can tell you that the majority of people that you come across door to door have been in church. And they all have horror stories. And if you talk to them, let them talk, and you listen to what they have to say, their experiences, it comes back to these three things. Somewhere pride, greed, and jealousy came in and caused this big thing, and they got hurt, and then they quit. Well, what we need to remind them of, and what we need to be reminded of, is it's not about the religion, it's not about the church you go to, it's not about your denomination, it's not about your group, it's about Jesus. Jesus didn't do any of those things. Jesus never committed sins of pride, jealousy, and greed. Jesus never destroyed churches. Jesus never destroyed homes. Jesus never destroyed relationships and marriages. Jesus should be your focus. And if you go to a church or you have a friend and they totally, royally mess you over, then go on and forget that church or that person, but don't let that affect your relationship with Jesus. And I've said this so many times. It'd be like me walking up and walking right past Linda and not talking to her. And she's like, well, what's wrong with him? And then she comes up later and says, well, Greg, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, Mike said something that offended me the other day. And Linda would say, well, and because of that, I'm not speaking to you.
That's right. Huh?
And Linda said, well, what's Mike doing that to you have to do with me?
That's right.
And the right answer is, should be nothing. Well, what does a church or another Christian offending you have to do with you and Jesus? But people are mad at Jesus because of what some other people did and churches have done to them. And it makes no sense. And it's the exact same thing. I'm not going to speak to Jesus anymore because somebody at that church hurt my feelings. It makes no sense. What was I watching? Oh, that's how Mormonism, the story behind Mormonism is that Joseph Smith went to these churches and they were all fighting with each other and they hurt people and everything. And so then he went out in the woods and supposedly had this vision from these angels that started Mormonism. You see that kind of thing all the time, especially if you visit and talk to people. It doesn't make any sense. Let's keep going because we're continuing to look at these people who Jude is referring us to and warning us about. Read verses 12 and 13.
These are spots in your feasts of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. Clouds they are without water, carried about of winds. Trees whose fruit withereth, without fruit, twice dead, plucked up by the roots. Raging waves of the sea, foaming out their own shame. Wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever.
Now you think I can get nasty. I mean, you think about that. Think about what he said there. When I talk about these false prophets and people, I don't, spare words. I think they're snakes. They're destroying lives. I don't think you can use strong enough language within, the confines of non-profane, words. But he interestingly, he uses 5 things to describe these guys, and the number of 5 in the Bible is related to death. You see that over and over, and the number 5 in death. He says they're spots in your feats of charity. Then he says they're clouds without water. What's more useless? They're trees without fruit. Again, useless. They're raging waves of the sea, foaming out their shame. I love waves in the ocean, but not the raging ones. I remember we ran out to Myrtle Beach and when I was a kid and go swimming, and the waves were, just normal waves. Well, 2 or 3 days into it, there was a storm coming up, and I didn't know, and the adults didn't really pay attention, and we just ran out there to go swimming, and I got out there, and these waves are, boom, hitting me, and then finally one takes me down, and my face just hits the sand, and I skin my face up, my nose and everything. So there's a difference between the nice little waves that are, this is fun, and then the kind that grab a hold of you and go, Well, that's what these guys will do to you. They are waves that will just crash and destroy those that are in their way. And he also calls them wandering stars. I don't know exactly what if there's such a thing as a wandering star in the sense of like our sun. Charlie, do you know anything about?
They refer to the wandering stars a lot of times like the planets, even because if you look in the sky, most of the stars will always follow one pattern,
Mm-hmm.
but the planets are off track.
Or if you saw a comet,
or something
like that, yeah,
right,
yeah.
A meteor or something.
Now keep in mind, people say, well, the Bible's not very scientific, because it says that. You have to understand the Bible came first.
That's right.
Don't correct the Bible with modern science terminology. The Bible came first, and the Bible calls those bodies in the sky that lit up and you could see, it calls them stars. The fact that the scientists break those down doesn't mean there's error in the Bible. And another word like dinosaurs, well, that word didn't come around 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, when the Bible talks about dragons and things, you can't say the Bible's in error because they invented a new word 100 years ago.
Doesn't the Bible say the earth was round before they even did that?
Yeah. Yeah, I was reading something today where the guy accused the Bible of teaching that the earth was flat. And I was like, where? I've never seen...
No, I've never seen that.
You'll hear people say that. Well, you believe in a book that says the earth is flat. Well, sorry, but you don't know what you're talking about if you say that.
Absolutely.
You just quoted, was that Job, where he talks about or that's Isaiah, where he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth. And then Job, what is it? Job says...
Job, too, because he does a lot.